and we have Julian Van Winkle joining us. So, Julian, if you can hear me, and you're down in Kentucky, thank you for joining us here in Delaware. How is Kentucky? How's the weather down there?
Hello, how you doing? Nice to hear from you. It's just like it usually is in the wintertime, 40 degrees and raining. So we can only stand so much of that before we got to go south a little bit anyway, or way up north to at least get some snow or something. But it's a little dismal, but it's not bad.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us tonight. Of course, 2020 has been certainly a year for restaurants to navigate. So we're doing this usually in person, and tonight some folks here in the restaurant, and then other folks at their home. So if you could just kind of maybe start with an overview of your company and some of the efforts that you've made since taking over, we'd love to hear it.
Well, sure. I don't know if you want a little brief history of where we come from, but obviously my grandfather, who was known as Pappy, he was a Julian P. Van Winkle Sr. He would have been if we were all three of us alive, but he started my family in the business before Prohibition, working for Mr. W. O. Weller and Sons in Louisville, Kentucky as a salesman, and operated with two other gentlemen, Mr. Stitzel, who ran the whiskey portion of that company, Stitzel Weller, and then Mr. Alex Farnsley, who was their a salesman also. And eventually those three started the modern day Stitzel Weller distillery, opened up Derby Day 1935 in Louisville. And their brands were Old Fitz, and eventually Old Fitzgerald, eventually W.O. Weller, obviously. And eventually I say they started the Rebel Yell label and also Cabin Still. And my dad joined my grandfather before the war, World War II, and after World War II. He was a veteran, went away for about 3 years in the South Pacific, and he joined my grandfather after the war, and Mr. Stitzel and Mr. Farnsley had passed away, so it was my dad and Pappy and my Uncle King McClure ran the distillery. Pappy passed away in 1965, and Dad operated the distillery until 1972 when we had some family stockholder issues, and Dad was forced to sell the Stitzel Weller distillery to a conglomerate called Norton Simon at the time. He did not want to sell, was forced to. The whiskey business was not good at all back then in the late 60s, early 70s, so vodka and light whiskeys were taken over, so that was tough to hang on to a distillery that aged whiskey for 10, 12, 15 years sometimes, so it was tough. He sold the distillery, but he kept the old Rip Van Winkle label, so he actually started back in business immediately using stocks of whiskey that he had made himself at Stitzel Weller, and continued bottling mostly decanters back then. Most distilleries, Wild Turkey and Beam, made thousands of them, but the people didn't care about the whiskey as much as they cared about the decanters that they put them in, whether they be school bottles or wildlife bottles or coal miners, firemen, anything you could think of. Now it's funny because if you find one of these bottles, you throw away the china or the porcelain part of it if you want to, but the whiskey's the more important part. So what was kind of given away back then now is very, very rare to if you find one of those old dusty bottles. But that's what he did, and I joined him in 1977, and he passed away 4 years later, in 1981, and I operated the distillery, or my brand, Old Rip Van Winkle, started the Pappy Van Winkle brand in the mid-90s, and my son joined me in 2001, and grabbed him right out of college at University of Kentucky, and we operated the business ourselves, bottling myself in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, had a little bottling house. And in 2002, we did a joint venture with Buffalo Trace, which is still in effect these days. It's been, it's been 18, it'll be 19 years in June. We've been partners with them. So they produce our whiskey for us under our recipe. They own the W.O. Weller label, so that's the same recipe as ours, using wheated bourbon whiskey. And obviously the rest is kind of history, the way things have taken off. So it's been very lucky for us, and we're blessed to have a brand like that that's so popular.
I appreciate that. And I think, Carl, you were mentioning, we were kind of talking about how when you go through and tasting it to determine what goes into each bottle.
Yeah, first of all, let me say, Mr. Van Winkle, that it's a great honor, and more importantly, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. Been a big fan of your whiskey for years, whenever I can get my hands on it, which is not that often. But I was reading in the Pappyland book about how you personally taste every barrel of the whiskey that eventually goes into the Pappy line each year. And I guess I was kind of curious. I know I read in the book that you have this taste for what used to be the old Fitzgerald coming out of Stitzel Weller that your grandfather used to make. And you must have an amazing palate to be able to find exactly the right whiskey to go into the Pappy line.
Well, it's not some. Thank you very much for all that. That's nice. Let me straighten this camera up a little bit. Um, it My son and I do taste either one or both of us, at least one of us, taste every barrel. And plus the staff at Buffalo Trace in their lab, they taste thousands and thousands of barrels every year because of all their high-end brands like Blanton's and Buffalo Trace and Eagle Rare. Um, but it's not so much what, I like what I like, and I'm 71 years old, so obviously that's kind of inbred. It is bred in me, I guess you call it. And then I know what I like, and I know what I'm used to, and what Buffalo Trace has produced for us is very close to, probably as close as you can get to what we used to produce at Stitzel Weller. So it's not so much, like I say, what we're looking for. It's just bad younger taste and bitter taste and harsh taste. Those barrels will throw out because they'll affect the whole batch if we don't throw them out. Let them age a little longer, or if they're completely bad, they'll be used for
Yeah, well,
something
speaking
else.
of the barrels that you
Not our
throw
whiskey.
out, there's a I guess I don't know if it's a myth or if it's true. Uh, the Weller 12 is supposed to be the Pappy reject or the junior Pappy. Is there any truth to that? I mean, I know it's basically the same recipe as what goes into the Van Winkle line, but is it really the lower end, the reject that doesn't make it each year into Pappy, or is it stand on its own?
No, they are the same barrels, and we are doing that now. We may maybe hope to tweak our distillation and entry proof and barrel proof and so forth down the road to make it a little closer to what we did at Stitzel Weller. But right now we're using the same barrels. But Weller 12 obviously is a bigger brand than ours, so they don't taste every barrel before they dump theirs. They make a bottling of it. So we taste every barrel, and the ones that are not quite right, we'll let them age longer or whatever. But you do find some differences. Some years people try the Weller 12 and taste ours, and they say theirs, Weller's better. And some years, of course, it depends on who's tasting, but they're very close, obviously. But the only difference is that we taste every barrel, so we're a little bit more picky about exactly what goes in there, just because of the size of the amount of barrels we dump for a bottling. So it's you want to get them just right and not have anything in there that's going to be funky or throw the
Julian, this
taste
is
off,
Ryan.
flavor
Tonight
profile
we
off.
have folks, many like Carl, that are well versed in bourbon, and some folks like myself and others joining tonight that are much more novices. We're going to taste the 10 through the 23 year. Can you maybe give us some, maybe for the novices, what they're maybe looking for, or the different notes, or the characteristics that they're going to see as they taste through these bourbons of yours tonight?
Well, again, they're all the same mash bill, same recipe pretty much. The 20 and 23 are not Buffalo Trace distillation yet. They're our interim distillery. We call it the Bernheim Distillery, which is which is still a wheated bourbon whiskey. But the 10-year, what you're going to find out as you get into the older ages of what we sell is a little more mellowness, and where the barrel obviously is taking effect and smoothing out some of the, even though the tannins are very strong, because bourbon has to be put in a brand new charred oak barrel. So the initial blast of oak and tannins and the chemicals in there make a big difference for those first few years. So our 10-year, which is our youngest, you'll get a big explosion of the char and the tannin and alcohol. And then is the 12 and 15, you taste those two, and the 12 is a little sweeter because it's picking up the sugars in the barrel. And then the 15, right in between obviously the 10 and 20, it's a lot more flavor. All the wine and whiskey nerds that describe all these great flavors that are in beverages these days can pick up 1,000 different notations of what they're tasting, but it's mainly some citrus and some just some mellowness. It calms the bite on the tongue is a lot less, even though our 15-year is 107 proof. It's a lot smoother. And then when you get up to the 20-year, that's what I used to call butter whiskey, because it's so smooth on the tongue and really sweet. And then as you start to get to the 23, then you get something that's definitely an after dinner sipping type of whiskey, like a cognac, because it's obviously got some wood to it, and it's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's, for that particular after dinner sipping, maybe with an ice cube or something, it's that's perfect for that. So it's really just the maturing of different flavors and more flavors, and then it kind of levels off. If you let bourbon age too long in the barrels, it becomes less sweet, and the barrel turns against you, so to speak. So you don't really see many 27, 8, 30-year-old bourbons out there, because number one, the barrels will probably be empty if you let them sit that long. But number two, the tannins take over and the sweetness goes away, and it's just not worth it to keep the bourbon in the barrel that long.
Well, unlike you, Julian, I just can't bring myself to drink the bourbon with some ice and a twist of lemon. But I prefer it straight up. But I think the folks here this evening would really like to know a little bit about why wheated bourbon. I mean, most bourbons are mostly predominantly corn, of course, and there's a little rye, and there's a little malted barley. The Van Winkle bourbons are wheated. The rye is gone, and there's wheat in the place of the rye. Why wheat?
We don't completely know where the wheated formula came from. Whether it was Mr. Weller that my grandfather worked for, or Mr. Stitzel was making that whiskey. It could have come from the old Fitzgerald brand that Pappy bought back around Prohibition, and we're not sure who started it, but my grandfather really liked it, and it aged a little quicker, so that you could sell, after Prohibition, you could sell a 4 or 5-year-old whiskey made with wheat versus rye a little sooner, and it was a little better because it would age a little quicker. Now saying that, when you age wheated bourbon whiskeys a little longer, like 15 and 20 and 23 even, they don't pick up as much of the wood and tannins in the barrels. They kind of age more gracefully. The rye recipe tends to bring out more of the astringent notes that might want to give you a little bite on the tongue or your back of your throat and so forth. So it's Pappy just liked it, and obviously it's what my father and I kind of grew up enjoying, and so we've stuck with it. And it just, not that rye recipe bourbons are any better than wheated bourbon recipes, but it's something we like, and obviously some other people like it too. So we've just kind of stuck with that same idea. But to answer your question, I don't know. We don't know exactly where the wheated. There's some theories on all this, but bourbon history is crazy because not a lot of it was written down. So we don't know the first distiller that was in Kentucky or that made bourbon, or it could have been Elijah Craig or Doc Crow or whatever. But not much of this was written down, so it's all kind of conjecture as far as how these stories came about.
Well, however it happened, it's fabulous stuff, and it's so much more distinctive than many other bourbons that are made with the traditional rye mash bill.
Tasting your bourbons, and I think a lot of folks, I think you mentioned it once, is, it's like the one thing that, if you're super rich, you might not necessarily be able to get a bottle of Pappy's because you just might not be able to find it. And so, in Delaware, it's hard to get. We have 150 people joining tonight that are all going to get to taste through all the years, and that's, I think, a good way of sharing it. There's a few ounces that we'll have left in the bottles, but those ounces we'll make available at the restaurant, so if folks come down to the restaurant, they can taste it as well. I think that's pretty good. The 23 year, what was the first year that you released that? Was that late 90s or when your son joined, or what was the first year that you released the 23?
I think it was mid 90s and maybe 96, 97. I've got all these old bottling records that we kept when I had my bottling plant in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, which operated from 83 until 2001. So, I could look a lot of this stuff up, but it was about 96 or 97 when it started.
You could have saved a couple of those bottles and sold them on eBay. And then,
I could, but it's illegal to sell liquor without a license, so I don't want to go there.
this is probably a side, or
maybe
some of the folks that like trading those bottles or whatever they're doing. But as restaurants, we appreciate what you've done as a family to kind of curtail that, because it gives us the opportunity to get these bottles and get them into our customers' hands and not charge an arm and a leg for it. So we're able to do a whole dinner tonight, and we did a couple of the Buffalo Trace products for some cocktails to start, and then they taste through the 10, 12, 15, 20, and 23, and we don't have to charge them too much for it, and they get a 7-course dinner. So I appreciate what you've done to try to curtail that secondary market.
Yeah, it's the real problem with it is, well, I guess two problems. Number one, it's illegal because the liquor laws are very, very strict in this country, and really in Kentucky they're quite strict, although they're at least loosening up a little bit as far as shipping and so forth. But if you buy something on the internet, you might not get the real deal. You might get counterfeit, and there's a lot of that going on, a whole lot of it going on. So we can't control that, but all we can do is put our suggested retail prices out there, which are anywhere from $70 to $300 and something for the 23. So we're happy for restaurants like yourselves and liquor stores that charge a decent markup and aren't unkind to their customers. I'll just say that way.
Have you ever been up to Delaware? You been to Delaware before?
I never have. I've been all around it, but Virginia, D.C., Maryland, and so forth, but Pennsylvania, but have never been that way.
Yeah, many areas we're considered the suburbs of Philadelphia.
Right.
Well, we have an accent. Is that what you said?
Yeah, a little similar to the Philadelphia/Maryland accent. It's a little bit distinctive.
We pronounce water, warder.
Well, Julian, I really want to say thank you, and I appreciate your time, and we appreciate you being here. I guess that the book that Carl mentioned earlier, the Pappy Land book, your sister wrote that. Is that right?
No, my sister wrote a book in 1999. I should have brought a prop with me.
What's the name of the one she wrote? I'm sorry.
I can grab mine, but she wrote one. But it's called "But Always Find Bourbon," and it's got a picture of Pappy, lighting the cigar on the cover, and it's basically the story of my grandfather and our family in the whiskey business through the ownership of Stutzel Weller. And then it goes on to how we got the distillery, or how Pappy built it. And my dad worked for Pappy after the war, and struggled with the business and was forced to sell it, but then started this new brand. And then there is a chapter in there about what I kind of carried on with as far as the Pappy label. And then the book that I just was part of, it wasn't my idea, but it's called Pappy Land, and it's written by Wright Thompson, who's a friend and is a senior writer for ESPN. And this idea was hatched by a book agent of a chef in Oxford, Mississippi, where Wright's from, and they came up with this idea 4 or 5 years ago, and I was a little skeptical because I'm not interested in about a book about myself or story or so forth. It's just not my cup of tea. But Wright did a great job of capturing our family history and our story. And my daughter's business, they have a dry good business using our brand, so to speak, and it's doing great. So it's a great story. And he came up with a story and matched his life with my life, and it's a fascinating read. It's very little of it is about bourbon. It's mostly about fathers and sons and relationships, and it's called The Story of Family, Fine Bourbon, and Things That Last, which really explain everything. So it's a great little read. It's only about 400 pages, if that many, maybe only 250 something, short read, but he did a great job. So we've had a lot of success with it, and it's been out a couple months. So thanks for bringing it up. But that's the two books that our family has: my sister's book and this book that just came out.
Okay, and your sister's book one more time.
It's called But Always Fine Bourbon: The Story of Old Fitzgerald.
And that one's available, I know, on your website, because I've seen it there.
Yeah, they both are available on our website, and if not, it's my daughter's website is pappyco.com, which they sell both the books there too.
I buy many a box of cigars from there.
Well, thank you. They are mighty fine. Try the maple syrup too. That's exceptional.
Yeah, I love the Pappy Family Reserve, the Toro size particularly. That Perique tobacco at the end is just fabulous.
Well, thank you. They, Drew Estates makes those for us, and they really do a nice job. They're so well made, which is the impressive part. There's nothing worse, as you know, a cigar falling apart or not drawing or so whatever. But the Drew Estates does a great job with their production, so we're happy with that.
Oh, I want to thank you, Pappy, for letting me spend my birthday with you. It's been a pleasure.
Happy birthday, Carl.
Yeah, the big 7-0.
7-0.
7-0.
Well, you're almost catching up to
He's
Julian
a little
here.
bit older than me, but
I hope you never catch up.
You have 2 more years experience here than Carl, I guess. Is that what you said? You're 72. Carl's now 70.
I'm just 71 and a half.
Julian, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time, and folks, check out the Pappy Van Winkle website for cigars, for books. What else do you have on there for people that want to enjoy it?
The girls, it's their separate business, but they've got bourbon barrel-aged maple syrup and clothing and glassware and some really unique stuff they come up with. It's I had a son. My wife and I had a son, Preston, and then 18 months later we had 3 identical triplet girls. So that's that company. So we had an instant family, but they've done a great job, and they've really they're blowing us away with their business acumen. So they really do a great job.
Well, I hope you have